children to do this year, the Queen Quet head on the body to Gullah Geechee Nation. So glad that 100 to 20, one more again, the Gullah Geechee TV station. We write you upon the UN, one more again, for this year first UN World Conference of Indigenous People. So we're so glad if we be part of this year for we ancestors, especially since this year the Middle Passage Month. And we culture and thing grow up right up on this year soil and thing like that because of that transatlantic slave trade. So we're so glad that 100 children that tune in and 100 children know if 100 to deal with me, 100 why know this year the work why I know.
Since the General Assembly's adoption of Resolution 66-296 and the initial discussions by the government of Bolivia, the Forum has concerned itself with the full, effective, and equal participation of Indigenous peoples in the preparatory processes for this event. Many will agree that preparations for this gathering had a very slow start, causing Indigenous peoples, including those who serve voluntarily as expert members of the Forum, to become deeply concerned at the uncertainty that was generated by lack of concrete UN action. However, since 2011, the Forum expert members have generously provided space in its agenda in order to build a spirit of partnership, inclusiveness, and respect between member states, Indigenous peoples, UN agencies, funds, and programs. And I believe that without the generosity of the Forum, this process would not have taken the form or momentum that has collectively propelled us to this opening ceremony and our substantive program for the afternoon and tomorrow. I genuinely hope this spirit of partnership continues at the regional and national level, and more importantly, at the Indigenous community level. Indigenous peoples have spent the last few decades building genuine cooperation with states in good faith, consistent with the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a strong testament as to what can be achieved when states and Indigenous peoples strive together to uphold the Charter's purposes and principles, and thereby strengthen the international human rights system as a whole. At this moment, it is highly important to underscore not only the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, but for all parties to be mindful of the pertinent international legal obligations of member states in relation to all peoples, including Indigenous peoples. Specifically, I would like to emphasize the peremptory norms of international law, and in particular, the principles and right to self-determination, as affirmed in the UN Charter, the International Covenants, the 1970 Friendly Relations Declaration, and, of course, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Furthermore, I must stress that even though the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a whole is not an expression of customary international law, some of its key provisions can reasonably be regarded as corresponding to established principles of general international law, therefore implying the existence of equivalent and parallel international obligations to which states are bound to comply with. The relevant areas of Indigenous peoples' rights with respect to which the discourse on customary international law arises are self-determination, the right to self-determination of Indigenous peoples, autonomy or self-government, cultural rights and identity, land rights, as well as reparation, redress, and remedies. In addition to the objectives of the hastily negotiated outcome document with the limited and carefully controlled participation of Indigenous peoples from across the globe. The peremptory norms of international law and customary international law principles remain essential and constant parameters for all future dialogue, negotiation, and implementation of the individual and collective human rights of Indigenous peoples. Furthermore, the content of the right to free, prior, and informed consent and the continuing importance of Indigenous peoples' rights to their lands, territories, and resources remain urgent and necessary features for the survival, sustainability, and vitality of Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities. For all future dialogue at the local, national, and especially the international level, we must recognize that consensus loses its validity if it is used to undermine the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, equality and non-discrimination, as well as good faith. Good governance becomes a casualty if a few states or even one state can undermine such essential rights and principles at the international level. We must recognize that Indigenous peoples are among the most vulnerable and disadvantaged in the world. Therefore, it is a huge injustice if they are severely undermined by a highly questionable practice that allows for the lowest common denominator to prevail. Former UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali underlined in 1993, quote, "Human rights is the common language of humanity," unquote. The human rights of Indigenous peoples must not be politicized or otherwise undermined by local, regional, and national state interests and agendas. Rather, Indigenous human rights must be respected and recognized by local, regional, and national governments. These principles and human rights are universal. They don't stop at the borders between so-called developed and developing states. All states must consult and cooperate with Indigenous peoples, consistent with their right to free, prior, and informed consent, as well as related state international obligations, including those pertaining to human rights, environment, and sustainable and equitable development. This high-level plenary meeting should be remembered for its contribution through a principled outcome document, a document that must be interpreted against the backdrop of international law, customary international law principles, and in particular, the human rights affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In conclusion, I call upon member states, guided by the spirit of solidarity and partnership with Indigenous peoples and consistent with their international legal obligations, as well as your political capacity to provide support for the effective implementation of the outcome document and its mutually agreed terms for cooperation within the framework of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Finally, let us ensure that not only are we guided by legal imperatives and international legal obligations, but also by moral imperatives. Thank you.
Before, let me express my humble appreciation to the Indigenous people of this territory for giving us a warm welcome and a spirit of blessings for us to be here. We really appreciate for that solidarity and for that welcome that we have received from the owners of the land and also Indigenous people from North America. Today, this morning, the international community made a commitment to recognize, to respect, to promote, and uphold the right of indigenous people globally. And for a long time, we have become subject to violation and abuses of rights, from south to north, from west to east. And today was a commitment that history of discrimination, the history of marginalization have to come to an end. And we want to express our gratitude that today the outcome document that was adopted today by the General Assembly is going to be implemented both at the national and the local level. What does it mean really for implementation? It means we are likely to see the end of land grabbing, the end of over-exploitation of our resources. The future is not today, the future is tomorrow. It's tomorrow about the generation to come. We hope at the national level, governments will put in place policy and legislation in order to promote and respect collective rights of indigenous peoples. I come from Kenya, and Kenya was a colony of the British. We lost a lot of land at that time, and today we continue to do the same. We hope the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples will give a hope that we've never seen for the many years as indigenous peoples across the globe. The Kenyan people adopted a very progressive constitution 2 years ago. Hopefully, at the national level being implemented, particularly the Bill of Rights, the chapter on land, the proposed mining law, the proposed eviction law, the proposed community land law will give us something to be proud about when being implemented. We hope free, prior, and informed consent will be a very important instrument that government will include in their own legislation and policies. There's nothing as government you lose by respecting, by promoting the right of indigenous peoples. In the spirit of partnership and collaboration, we hope the implementation of the outcome document will see the greed of the private sector in the name of the extractive industry will give us a room and environment that we are going to be able to live. In conclusion, for the national implementation of the right of indigenous peoples, is government to respect their own political and moral and constitutional duty. In Africa, where I come from, we hope government in Africa will respect and implement the decision of the African Commission on Human and People Rights, where to come to decisions in relation to indigenous people rights and resources. It's my pleasure to share this session this afternoon. Thank you.
Presidente, ahora vamos a dar la palabra a los dos oradores, a quienes solicito respetuosamente limitar sus intervenciones a 5 minutos máximo. Por favor, voy a dar la palabra al profesor Anaya. Profesor Anaya, usted tiene la palabra.
Muchas gracias, señor co-presidente. Distinguished representatives of member states and of indigenous peoples from throughout the world, ladies and gentlemen, It's an honor and pleasure for me to participate in this panel on implementing the rights of Indigenous peoples at the national and local level. I think at the outset, we need to understand that implementing the rights of Indigenous peoples is about fundamental change. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples reminds us of the rights that have been systematically denied at the national level, and it marks a path toward the changes that are needed to bring those rights into the reality of Indigenous people's lives. The historic adoption of the Declaration in 2007 has been accompanied by important changes in the constitutions, laws, and policies of a number of countries that in one degree or another embrace the rights affirmed in the Declaration and seek to make them operational. But by and large, throughout the world, a great deal more change is required. In my view, the most formidable obstacle to fully implementing the rights of Indigenous peoples is, simply put, ignorance. Ignorance among the broader societies and political elites in the countries in which Indigenous peoples live. We can indeed celebrate that here at the headquarters of the United Nations on this day, the representatives of the national governments of the world and others profess commitment to the rights of Indigenous peoples. But across the street in this city and around the globe, ignorance abounds about the conditions of Indigenous peoples, their aspirations, and the human rights imperatives that compel change. This ignorance is manifested and perpetuated by popular stereotypes that render Indigenous peoples relics of the past amid images of savagery or attitudes of curiosity and romanticism. Here in the United States, a prominent example is the use of Native American names and caricatures by professional sports and other teams, such as the appropriation of the pejorative Redskins by the professional football team based in the nation's capital. The stereotypical images and attitudes are also present in the mainstream media, such as many saw when CNN aired a story that disparaged and made light of the traditional Maori reception that was given British Prince William when he visited New Zealand earlier this year. Perhaps most contributing to widespread ignorance of Indigenous people's realities are the mainstream educational systems, within which those realities have been largely absent or distorted. Within mainstream education, history has regarded colonial and settler patterns as triumphant precursors to modern states, with little attention to the devastating consequences of those patterns for Indigenous peoples in both the past and the present. Within the dominant historical narrative, Indigenous peoples have been cast into the roles of the savage or backward foe, of an obstacle to be overcome, or alternatively, as the unwitting, noble savage destined to succumb to modernity. In the outcome document that was adopted by consensus this morning, UN member states renewed their affirmation of the rights enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and expressed deepened commitment to the implementation of those rights. But even if we accept the sincerity of the expressions by member states to advance deliberately with steps to implement Indigenous people's rights, and I for one do, those steps will be hobbled by the ignorance they must confront. The political will that is necessary to the change that implementation requires can hardly take hold if majority societies are ignorant of the realities of Indigenous peoples that justify the change. The commitment to implement the rights of Indigenous peoples must therefore carry with it programs of education and awareness raising that reach throughout society. Education about Indigenous issues and reality must be mainstreamed into state, primary, and secondary educational systems. The media should be encouraged and should itself adopt specific programs to become educated about Indigenous peoples in relation to contemporary events. And government authorities at all relevant levels should be made aware of their functions, of how their functions touch and should touch upon Indigenous people's lives. In all these educational and awareness-raising efforts, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples itself can be an instructional tool. Finally, Indigenous peoples themselves should be invited and be prepared to contribute to all such educational and awareness-raising efforts in the spirit of reconciliation, partnership, and commitment to the human rights of all that is represented by the Declaration. Thank you very much.
Your family, or even your generation, makes your decisions on behalf of 7 generations hence. Those layers and layers of humanity waiting their turn on earth will be determined. Their fate will be determined by who sit here today. I think that this generation is the generation that is going to make the decision whether we survive as a species. And so, I bring you greetings from our Indigenous people around the world. And I'm going to repeat. We are the keepers of traditions, ceremonies, histories, and future of nations, and we're the ones who escaped your proselytization. We survived with the wisdom of the old ones. And we're pleased to add our voices to yours in this great effort for common sense and peace among nations. Leaders of the world, I bring you a most urgent message that was brought through our annual gathering of the traditional circle we did in elders and youth. This message was brought by a runner from the north, a traditional person from Greenland. He said, the ice is melting. He informed us that years ago they noticed trickles of water coming down the sheer face of Glacier Mountain, and that trickle has grown to a roaring river of ice, water pouring out of the mountain into the Atlantic Ocean. Thousands of feet of ice has been lost. And it continues to melt, and it accelerates. I remind you, the acceleration is what we're dealing with. The compounding effect that we are now fully engaged. We're here, leaders of the world, as a collective voice. We join this mission of peace. We add our presence in support of this great effort for reconciliation between peoples and nations. We agree there must be parity and equity between rich and poor nations, between white people and people of color, and rich people and poor people, with special attention to women, children, and indigenous people. We in our collective voice add this: there must be reconciliation between peoples in the natural world, between nation states and the forests that sustain us, between corporations and resources that they mine, the fish that they catch, the water that they use. Leaders of the world, indigenous nations and people believe in the spiritual powers of the universe. We believe in the ultimate power, the authority, and limitless energy beyond our comprehension. We believe in the order of the universe. We believe in the laws of creation, and that all life is bound by these laws. We call this essence spirit of life. This is what gives the world the energy to create and procreate, and become the ponderous and powerful laws of regeneration, the law of the seeds. Leaders of the world, we in our collective voices speak to this to remind you that the spirit and spiritual laws transcends generations. We know because this is what has sustained us. Religion and spirituality is vital to survival and moral law. It is a faith that has sustained our human spirit to our darkest hours. It has sustained our human spirit in times of crisis during the times we suffered to the grinding measure of inexorable persecution that has spanned generations and continues today. Yet here we are today, adding our voice to this peace for sanity, the leadership and responsibility to the future generations whose faces are looking up from the earth, each waiting their time to be here. Leaders of the world, the collective voices of Indigenous people, and that we are saddened by the absence of many of our brothers not allowed to be here. However, we believe that reconciliation should begin here because peace is an inclusive term. We include everyone. And peace and reconciliation is the purpose of this fund. Peace is dynamic and requires great effort of spirit and mind to attain unity. Leaders of peace must step forward and take responsibility for a paradigm change in the direction of current lifestyle and materialistic societies. The human species has become the most voracious and abusive consumer of Earth's resources. We have tipped the balance against our children, their future, and we imperil all night. Leaders of the world, despite all of our declarations and all of our proclamations, no matter how profound they may be, the ice is melting and north. We see the acceleration of the winds. We see the fires that are raging around the world. Insects moving northward. Atlantic. We're dealing with all this. And we see the sun's rays that provide us with light, energy, and the very essence of life, now causing sickness among our people, blinding animals, and killing the plankton and the sea. This is only the beginning, and we're helpless already. And we will now see the real power, the spiritual power of the earth. Leaders of the world, there can be no peace as long as we wage war against our beloved earth. Responsible and courageous actions must be taken to realign ourselves with the great laws of nature. We must meet this crisis now while we still have time. We offer these words as common people in support of peace, equity, justice, and reconciliation. And as we speak, the ice continues to melt in the north. There's an addendum to this. I gave this speech 14 years ago in this very hall. So what have we learned? And this effort for me to speak on behalf of the Indigenous people, and I thought, well, what will I write now? I said, well, I don't need to write. I just need to repeat what we said to you 14 years ago that you have lost. We've lost those precious years. So I urge you to listen to our voice. We are the pulse of Mother Earth. We have experience, and we have a lot of knowledge. So keep our languages. You might have to call on us again. Thank you.